Hello again, everyone. Nice to see you. For those of you who are new, I'm Antoaneta Roussi, and I cover cybersecurity at POLITICO. And it's very nice to be invited to do two panels for today's conference. So I would please like to invite my panelists, you know who you are, to the stage. Max, Hans, I'm talking to you. Sami, Clotilde. So today we'll be discussing cloud, data, AI, strategic autonomy, how to be resilient. So to introduce our distinguished panel, from the very far right, Hans de Vries, who's the Chief Cybersecurity Officer of ENISA, so that's the EU's cybersecurity agency. Next to him is Mr. Max Peterson, who's Vice President of Sovereign Cloud at Amazon Web Services. To his left is Clotilde Bômont, researcher at the Institute for Strategic Studies and the GEODE Center. And last but not least, Sami, Khoury, head of the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. Thank you for joining me. So when we speak about strategic autonomy or sovereignty, everyone has a different opinion. In Brussels, let alone the global stage, it's safe to say that it's one of the most divisive topics, because what is strategic autonomy for one country may be extreme protectionism for another. But in today's geopolitical context, unless countries increase their strategic autonomy, countries are at risk of being vulnerable to external pressures and threats. Cloud, data, AI, they're all key in harnessing innovation, sharing information, and helping increase security. But they must also themselves be secure. So, I would like to start off with more of an open question. Data sovereignty versus data residency. What are the vulnerabilities with each? And perhaps that can go straight to Hans, if you allow me.
Yes, you may. Since I'm still in the amazement phase, I just started with the new role on the 1st of April, so I still feel I'm in the looking around amazement phase, to be honest. Data sovereignty, and one of the things that really comes up to mind is the cybersecurity risk that in general comes up. And we all know that cybersecurity is borderless. But the moment you talk about cyber sovereignty, how do you deal with that? For instance, the international data sharing agreements that you need if you have it in several environments, or with the cross-country data flow that's happening, because it's going to happen anyway. But how do you deal with that, and how do you keep a judicial control of that? That's one of the big things that are happening. Data localization requirements is also a part that you have to look into the moment you come up into this. So there are definitely challenges coming about, and especially if you want to talk about country jurisdiction, who has authority and who has not, especially. So there are definitely a lot of things that are happening, whether you're talking about data sovereignty or not, because even when you're using, let's say, a service from the Netherlands and it's being used in Belgium, you might have the same questions. Who's going to be the court of law that's applicable? So I mean, it's not only on a, let's say, US, EU based, it's also within the EU itself.
Yeah, that's very interesting about who sort of has that authority and how, you know, we mentioned it on the first panel about cooperating police, fighting crime, and all of that.
Do we have a free flow of data on the panel here?
Of course.
Max, please.
So number one, I'm in the amazement phase too. I just took on this responsibility as the Vice President of Sovereign Cloud at AWS in October of last year. And I actually think that we shouldn't think about it as a compromise. We should think about it as an and. For instance, the conversation about data localization, there's a complementary need for resilience and survivability. And we saw that in the most extreme case in Ukraine, where had they relied just on data locally in Ukraine, they would have suffered a great loss of digital capacity from a country perspective. And we were fortunate to work with them early on to help them actually get their data into the cloud and their applications in a secure fashion to provide the resilience and survivability that not just government needed, but their banking systems like Privat Bank needed. And so I do think in the discussion and the dialogue, it's important that we think holistically, and we know that there are some cases where you've got trade-offs that you make that have to be well-reasoned trade-offs.
Clotilde, you study this quite closely, I'm aware. Tell me from a sort of French perspective how data sovereignty and protectionism of that data is seen.
Well, thank you, Antoaneta. I think that first, to go back to your first question, I would not oppose data sovereignty and data residency, and they are not opposed or antinomic, and to me, on the contrary, they are very complementary, because I see residency as a means, as a measure to attain digital sovereignty and data sovereignty. And data sovereignty can be seen as a political project involving many other measures, such as binding laws, binding regulations, developing industrial capabilities, or even data localization is one among them, of course. And so to me, data residency is a good start to ensure that we keep control of the data, but it is not the only parameter. And as Hans just said, mainly because of the extraterritorial reach of some jurisdiction, of some laws, which is a threat, at least in the French perspective, to data confidentiality and greatly limits the effectiveness of data localization. And so this is the case, for instance, of laws such as the 2017 Chinese law on national intelligence, or the very recent extension of the American Foreign Intelligence and Surveillance Act in April 2024. And so I would say that in a French perspective, data sovereignty is how do we keep control of our data? And I think that goes with keeping control of strategic technologies. And that doesn't mean that we want to be totally independent. We are aware that we need these interdependencies, but we want them to be fully consented. We want them to be transparent and mutual. I think that the main definition, and probably the definition that is close to strategic autonomy of the French data sovereignty.
Right. And Sami, you are based in Canada, and I think for myself, at least, I don't know quite how the sort of public cloud or the conversation in Canada has been. So maybe you could just give us a little picture of that.
Sure. Those two concepts of residency and sovereignty are very important concepts. Unfortunately, often we use them interchangeably, which confuses the issue. And so it's important to realize that, in our mind at least, residency is where the data is, sovereignty is the legal framework around which the data is controlled. And we need to work with both of them, so it's not one or the other. There are cases where government data has to be in Canada. So certain level of data classification, the data has to be in Canada. In other cases, we are happy that the data is in the public cloud and replicated maybe in another data center outside of Canada. So important to balance the needs of what your data is, what protections you want around the data, where do you need that data, but also looking at the sovereignty element in one way. We're also shifting a little bit our mindset around sovereignty to look at sovereignty comes from an old Cartesian context of X, Y, and that defines where the data is, but we're looking at it from the perspective of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that will help us determine, from a sovereignty perspective, the confidentiality of the data, how is that protected, how is the integrity of the data, and also the availability of the data. And if I don't care about availability, I could have confidentiality and integrity maybe in a friendly country, not in Canada. So how do we balance those two concepts is what we are working on in Canada when it comes to data in the cloud.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, not necessarily having your data local doesn't necessarily mean it's secure, right? And I mean, you know, if we physically had it in the room, you could probably do your best to secure that room, but if someone enters the room, you're screwed. Whereas if it's distributed, I mean, there's different risks and challenges with that, but at least, you know, if one data center is in Spain and another one is in Ireland or Iceland, you know. The EUCS in Europe, the European Cloud Certification Scheme, for those of you who've not made eyes with it, has been a hot topic in Brussels, and you know, big tech like AWS and others, and Microsoft, Oracle, etc. They've sort of, it feels like they've met the European Commission halfway with their pitch for a sovereign cloud and their investment in sort of developing these data centers operated by Europeans. The French don't see that as good enough. So Clotilde, maybe you can, what do you think about that pitch? I mean, technically it still meets the requirements and some critical data is going to stay here, but why is it not good enough?
Yeah, I think that it is true that in France we sometimes see the integration of American multinationals in cloud solutions as a threat to the security of our data or to the development of our industries. And this French position stems from our conception of strategic autonomy, as I said, according to which excessive dependence, including on our allies, and I insist on the ally, hinders our freedom of decision and action. And either because we seek to protect the interests of the actor on whom we depend, or because this actor can constrain our choices. And this is why we want to limit our dependencies and establish a form of mutuality and transparency. But some European states, that's true, on the contrary, see collaboration with the USA as a guarantee of economic profit and as reinforcing European security, especially from a NATO perspective. So thus, to them, excluding American multinationals could affect their resiliency and far beyond digital issues, since it could also become an economic or even a national security issue. And this is precisely what divided the member states over the EUCS. But I want to insist on the fact that there is no doubt that cooperation with American multinationals is at some point needed so that we can develop standards and compatible cloud environments. And also because the US and the European states are like-minded countries when put in a global perspective. And cooperation is essential to face the many rising threats with, for instance, AA or disinformation, especially coming from authoritarian countries.
Max, maybe you can give a bit of an industry perspective on that. I mean, it was a big investment for you guys to decide to, I mean, you've essentially changed your business model to appease the Europeans. What a bunch of annoying officials.
We have a very simple premise, and we call it customer working backward. And so we work backwards from customer requirements. And you said something really interesting at the start. Digital sovereignty, by definition, means something a little bit different in every country that you're in. And so we spent a lot of time listening deeply to the customers and to the regulators. And we came up with 4 foundational things that typically comprised this topic area called digital sovereignty. And the first one is data. And so customers want to make sure that they have protection, privacy, control, and that they and only they have provenance over their data. And so that's thing number 1. AWS was the first cloud provider who guaranteed that customers and only customers get access to their data, both with the technical measures that we implemented and with the contract provisions that we implemented. And so the rule of law is an important construct. The second thing that we always hear is operational control. Customers want to know that they and only they have access to their workloads and their data that's running on the cloud. When we hear customers say that, it actually caused us to go and get an independent third party to review our virtualization system called Nitro and be able to give a third party attestation that nobody, not even AWS operators, have access to customer workloads or customer data on Nitro-powered instances. And then we took that and we made that part of the contract protections. The third thing that we hear from customers is that they want resilience, and even more today, they want survivability. From these extreme circumstances like foreign invasion in Ukraine. The fourth thing that we hear is independence and transparency. And that's an expectation that the technology providers that they're going to choose to work with have the ability to operate independently. And so that was that final piece that drove our decision to invest nearly 8 billion euros in building a European sovereign cloud. Because to deliver that independence, we had to put all of the identity and access management, all of the billing systems, all of the systems that manage not just customer data, but customer-created metadata into a dedicated region. And then we had to organize it so that it was entirely EU-based, operated by EU residents, only from EU locations, subject to EU law. And so it's really a concatenation of all of those end customer requirements that led us to decide now was the time, despite having 8 regions already in Europe and 6 already in the EU, that some highly regulated industries and some highly sensitive government work needed these additional protections.
So did you create the sovereign cloud offering just for Europe?
Well, it actually, the world is not a small place. And there are tons of companies that serve European customers that are not based in Europe also. So we view it as a cloud for serving those highly regulated and those more sensitive government requirements in Europe, but not just for Europe. And so any company that delivers solutions, just like they do on the AWS commercial cloud, they'll be able to run in the AWS European Sovereign Cloud to serve their European customers with those additional protections, that we think about. So yes, absolutely for Europe, but the other 6 regions are also for Europe, and those that are serving Europe.
But you're not replicating it for now in Asia or North America, or you are?
Replicating a what?
The sort of sovereign cloud data in the country model.
Across the AWS regions already in Europe, if customers want data residency, we talked about how many different...
But within Europe, not, say, Asia, like, I don't know, Malaysia wants to have its data in Malaysia.
That's good. They're going to have an AWS region.
All
No,
right.
no, it is. It's really a matter. Again, this is why it's great to sit with Hans and to listen to the other colleagues. It's a matter of being able to address common requirements at scale, and that's really the key. Is working together, whether it's cyber, or cloud, or digital sovereignty. The key is really working together to make sure that we can address these things at scale and protect the innovation and the foundational security that you need to progress economically.
Hans, the move to, to be less or more resilient, do we need to exclude people like Max, or is he friendly?
I'd like to support my French colleague saying that we're part of the allied environment, and you definitely understand that there is cooperation needed. I also understand that there could be very small instances of such a, let's say, secure environments that you need perhaps even a localized version. I mean, I used to work for the intelligence, and we created our own IP packages, and we created our own telephones to communicate safely within the Netherlands. So I fully understand that process. Having said that, I'm not really sure what's going to be the outcome of the CS discussion. ENISA has helped from 2019 to help creating drafts. The current draft is to the Commission, and so they will have the next steps forward, and I hope there will be some smoke, whether it's black or white, but looking at Rome, we need to find a new pope in that sense. So within a few weeks, I think we find some more answers on that. But having said that, we are in an allied environment. It's a complex environment. We're not only from an EU perspective, but also NATO from a physical security perspective, if you talk about defense. So it's not such a simple things to decide. So you have to look at all the different sides. And I think that we're trying to do that on a European level.
Yes, I'm also waiting for the white smoke.
Could I add one other thing? Because to your question about data residency, so the European Sovereign Cloud is going to provide a full hyperscale cloud region, all the same technical features, all the same service features that you have anywhere in the world. It's going to enable a different capability for Europe also. And we have these AWS edge solutions where customers can put AWS infrastructure into their data centers. It's called dedicated local zones. The Singaporean government did it last year. In fact, we partnered with them because they had a statutory requirement to keep certain information inside government data centers. But they wanted to be able to operate with the same sort of seamless capability. And so we announced dedicated local zones, which are AWS services that are deployed into customer data centers. And the customers get to own the physical security. And because it's dedicated to that customer set, they get to implement additional operational controls. And so there is, in our opinion, no one size fits all for everything. You have to be able to listen and work across these different constraints. The one thing we know for sure is people don't want to compromise on security. They don't want to compromise on innovation. And they realize to keep pace in today's world, they have to be able to move quickly.
Sami, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, Max said that they started the customer and work it backward. I'll say we started the data and work it from there. I grew up in an organization that was very much focused on how do we secure data. We are the cryptologic agency for Canada, so how do we protect government data up to top secret data? So it's not just your commercial citizens' data. So we developed a security profile that go all the way up to top secret. Not all of them can be transposed into a cloud environment. And as we move these protection profiles into the cloud, we challenge the cloud providers to meet our requirements. So we're not compromising on security, but in a sense, we are saying this is what we think a PB profile looks like on-prem. Now, how do we implement that in the cloud? And then keep pushing them. And I was talking with Max before, and he says, we pushed AWS to implement new security features so that they meet the PB profile of the Canadian government, so that now we can put workloads in the commercial cloud, in the commercial regions in Canada. We are now pushing further than that and maybe looking at, can we put secret data in the cloud and understanding, workload separation, process separation, all these things. Some of them today, that mindset is very much an on-prem mindset, and how do we shift it into a space of virtuality? And it's one thing to say, I have the data center in Canada, but I cannot touch the data, right? So somebody else is hugging the server somewhere in the data center. So how do we transpose that mindset? For us, it's important to know your data, and once you know your data and what protection profile, then you can apply the profile in a commercial cloud. We are looking at private clouds. We're not there yet, but we hopefully will get there. But the two key things is deploying the protection profile and deploying the sensors that we have developed at the Cyber Center. So no government agency can go in the cloud without, one, certifying that the protection profile has been applied, and two, that our sensors have been installed in the tenancy, and then they get their key to the cloud and they could go wild and have fun.
Sounds pretty legitimate to me. I don't know who wants to take this one, but Do we need more rules to protect personal data from authoritarian countries, especially with the rise of AI and this global tech race? Hans, since you're not making eye contact, I'll go to you.
I was looking at my notes a little bit. I think within Europe we have already quite some rules that are working in tandem. We have the EU AI Act, we have the Digital Market Act, we have the Digital Service Act, and the GDPR. And I think the four will definitely get a good grip on protecting the personal data of the citizens. And there's also very important that we focus on the misuse by company, that they're working on that. So I think from my perspective, I think those four are already well enough coming into play to really focus on that, whoever wants to deal with it.
Great. Sami?
Sure. Oh, you want to go ahead, Max? Or?
No, Sami, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, citizens' data is super important. And if government holds citizens' data, the onus is on us. And we have to protect that data as much as we can. The challenge we have is that there are many private sector companies that have citizens' data, insurance companies, other life insurance, home insurance, all of these things. So it's important that we educate them. So as a cyber center, it's important that we educate them on the risks of where the data is or how they treat the data. Having redundancy does not mean having a region in Canada and having a region in China and playing the redundancy game between the two. But also educating citizens, and we talk about that. I talk about it all the time when it comes to social media and educating our citizen about giving unfettered access to all these social media apps where you don't know where the data is going. So I think it's on us to make sure that everybody understands that data is the new oil, as people say, and that we need to protect it. We're not going to we ban certain apps, but that's minor. But we're not in the business of banning apps, but about educating citizens to the value of their personal data.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about bans because, I mean, yeah, the conversation has been very topical, especially in the context of a big election year. And I mean, yesterday I saw on the news that Donald Trump has created TikTok, even though he was blasting it before. But, these apps are now so, they're global and kids are using them, so, you can't stop them. But maybe I can go to you, Clotilde, and just to touch on that, with the rise of AI and how can we make sure that data is protected and also free to be shared?
That's $1 million question. No, I think that we need to have secure infrastructures. That would be the basis. And I will circle back on the fact that we need to have control of our data. And to make them free of flow, we need to have common regulations, common standards. And I think that goes also for AI. That's definitely what proves the EU AI Act. And that we need to, I think it's an ongoing discussion. And on AI, I don't have many things, but just have common regulations that will help the flow of data probably.
Can I add just a little thing? Because we talked about regulation, right? But I think awareness is a much more powerful part that we really have to move forward. And it's not only from, let's say, educated people like ourselves, but especially kids. Also on education-wise, schools, we really have to make sure that understanding the digitization and the impact of it should be part of the curriculum on any school. It's not currently. We have to make sure that within the social media, the rules and regulations are more strict. If you take TEMU, it says we're not allowing kids to buy anything, but there is no control in there. So there are a lot of things that we could add apart from the 4 things that I mentioned. And it might be that if everything is from full force, we need some certification, but we'll see after that. But it's about implementing it. And then looking at what do we miss and how do we create focus on that, and that's really important.
Yeah, I would just say +1 on the implementation. You know, technology is going to evolve, and therefore you're going to have a policy and regulation that'll evolve. But I think in the suites that you talked about, we've got enough guidance that we really need to focus on implementation, because that's where the threat is. And so building the culture in each of our organizations and in the enterprises, you know, in each of our countries, and all the way down to the school level, that is going to have a more beneficial effect than some, you know, net new tweak on the privacy law or on GDPR or something else. And I think the other thing that's important is to remember just how important it is that we do work together. And so in February, I got to be part of a collective agreement called the Munich Accord to fight disinformation with generative AI in elections. It's a real threat in this year where 500 billion people will be voting, and this is something that no one organization can do by themselves. And so it was a collection of technology organizations and supporting government officials, right, that said we've got to come together to fight election fraud from Gen AI. So I think it's a reminder that the shared, you know, alliance and the shared, you know, values in Western countries, as opposed to autocracies that are going to just control the internet and dictate it, you know, is the way that we have to respond.
Yeah, we were supposed to have a 5th panelist today from the US Cybersecurity Agency, but unfortunately wasn't able to join us. But, you know, Hans, I wanted to give you the chance to just, the US CISA and ENISA have been working sort of more and more cooperatively, and they signed a sort of working agreement last year. How does this, you know, have you discussed this stuff about strategic autonomy? And I'm sure there's some points that differ, but perhaps you can just give us a little taste.
I think we are looking at the things that we see equal more than what differs us, because the technologies are the same. Processes to implement are most of the times the same. The use or misuse is probably the same. The adversaries are the same. So we have a lot in common to talk about how do we organize and create awareness on different levels. The difference is that CISA is focusing on organizations and states. ENISA is focusing on member states. So we're trying to help member states. So we do it in a subsidiary mechanism. So my former organization, the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands, they will deal with the critical and the essential organizations within the Netherlands, and BSI will do that in Germany. And we are here to help them, to those organizations to really move forward, but also looking for the harmonized way. So that's also the part that both CISA and we are looking, but not only CISA, but also with OECD, together with the Commission, looking at, okay, how can we harmonize things much better than we do now? So a few weeks there was a G7 meeting. There we were talking about harmonizations as well, because we fully understand that harmonization is the need forward. If you talk about incident reporting, you might see that through the localization of NAS2 into national law, there might be differences in reporting requirements, and therefore an organization might be forced to have several different setups to different organizations because they ask for different things. So we have to harmonize that. From my perspective, I personally are really looking forward to help with ENISA to create that harmonization across Europe, and if that has a bigger impact, that's good as well.
Sami, you mentioned bans earlier. I mean, the European Commission last year in its sort of 5G security toolbox, put out a review and you know, mentioned in this case Huawei and ZTE and the Chinese telecom and cloud providers as you know, essentially high-risk vendors, and that EU countries shouldn't be well working with them, but they do provide, in some cases, very good offerings, you know, for a bang for your buck. So I was just wondering, in Canada, has that conversation been similar, and how have you dealt with it there?
Yeah, we've had a similar conversation in Canada on that. So we currently, in the Telecommunication Act in Canada, security is not a tool by which we can differentiate between vendors. That is changing, but for the last roughly 10 years, we've been working on a voluntary base with the telecom operators to assess the technology, to work with them on where it's going to deploy, and to voluntarily recognize that certain technology cannot be deployed in certain parts of the country. So we've worked with them, and they've been great at it. But last year, the government has tabled an amendment to the Telecommunication Act in which security now will feature prominently as a tool of decision making. And the first sign of the implementation of that tool is the banning the high-risk vendors. So the government has signaled the banning of both Huawei and ZTE. So the telecom operators today that have that technology, as we say, are reading the tea leaves and are starting to replace their infrastructure. We didn't have a lot. We mostly had it in the RAN side of the network. So they're replacing the RANs that they had from Huawei with other RANs. But we still have to do the complete security evaluation. So, you know, not because it's not Huawei or ZTE that it means it can automatically be deployed, because we care about the security of that infrastructure, and we care about continuing to raise the bar with all the vendors to make sure that the security of their offering is top-notch. So yes, to banning those two vendors, and maybe if there's another vendor that, as we do the security, we recognize that it's hopeless and they're not getting it, maybe that will be added to the list too as a vendor to say, you don't take security seriously, and the government will issue then a directive that says you cannot use that technology. So that's how we're doing in the telecommunications space in particular.
I mean, Alibaba is also a Chinese cloud provider, and as far as I understand, it is the official provider for the International Olympic Committee. So that proposes quite a challenge, don't you think, Clotilde? Especially since they're in Paris this year.
Thank you, Antoaneta. Yeah, that's a risk. That's a risk, I would say. Like yeah, that's a messy one. Yeah, no, this is definitely a risk, but I'm sure that we have all the security measures that we need to make that secure. And the same way that we are using foreign and non-European other solutions, we try to, you know, manage the data, keep control, and make sure that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that's another very important point, is ensured, and especially during this very demanding time as the Olympic Games.
Yeah, I mean, it just, sorry to put you on the spot, it's just an example of how interweaved we are, right, with data, with cloud providers. I mean, it's such a, yeah, these are global companies, and we talked about it in the first panel, this sort of, are we going towards two internet solution, you know, because at the same time, the more sovereignty and the more sort of protectionism you put on yourself to heighten your security, the more divisive it can become between democratic and autocratic areas, which is also not a good thing necessarily. I would like to open up the panel to some questions if there are some from the audience. Yes, I see a hand. Gentleman with the grey suit there.
There's so many.
The one I'm looking at.
Thank you. Andreas Walbrot. Again, Enclave. You raised quite a few points around sovereignty and resiliency, as it says in the title. And then we heard all the wonderful stories what AWS is doing, and I believe if somebody from a temporary market companion of yours with a G or an A in their cloud name would have similar stories to tell. When I think about resiliency, I often think about no login. I can move from A to G to next A or to whatever. When I hear the stories from a vendor perspective, of course, you must have an interest. When I hear the Canadian stories, how much have you put focus on being able to, let's say, disperse the information and the tools in terms of resiliency across multiple providers? Not because one might turn evil and the other's good, but because one might simply have an error, because in technology errors do happen, at least over the last few years that I've been in this industry. And so that's the question. What are you doing in terms of, as a government, in terms of being able to deploy across many or at least multiple providers, and what is you doing as a vendor to be open to allow your clients to disperse across multiple infrastructures?
Thank you very much. Sami, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So a few years ago, the government issued an RFP for CSPs, cloud service provider, to apply, sort of be pre-qualified, and I think we received 13 submissions. There was some filtering criteria, so Alibaba did not apply, or try to apply, but they did not make it through. But then after that, we looked to departments to do the proper risk assessment on the data to decide. So we build a protection profile, but to be fair, we started building with the big three, Azure, Google, and AWS, and we're working our way down the list. So there are some cloud providers who might have maybe a more economical offering or a smaller offering, but we did not get to building the protection profile for them. It's a capacity issue. So at least now we can disperse across 3 of them. But the challenge we have is not a technology challenge. It's more of a, I would say, procurement challenge, because you run a pilot on one, and then you say, I'm going to go in production, and you basically perpetuate the use of that provider. The government looked at a way to say you have to renew your tenancy every 3 years, every 5 years, but re-hosting is a lot of work. You can't simply take something that you hosted on AWS and push it. The technology is not there yet. I mean, maybe one day we'll get to a point where I can re-host more easily, but we're not there yet. So it has made some CSPs a little bit unhappy because, if I started a small pilot here and turned into production because the pilot worked, suddenly their footprint grows bigger. But that's the reality of the world we live in. But I'm the technology guy, so I'll let the procurement policy people find a way out of it. But we definitely are concerned about the ease of rehosting because we want that diversity, and we're still not there where I can run something on one cloud provider and store the data in another one. The fabric is not there, so we don't get the performance that we want. Even though we want to do it, it's going to take a few years to get us to a point where the fabric is almost transparent and performing.
Sorry, Sami, CSP, for those of us...
Cloud service provider, yeah.
I don't like acronyms.
Like AWS.
Right.
And the others. Let me just quickly say a couple things. Thing number one is customers should always have freedom of choice. And AWS's approach to it has always been customer usage. And if customers find a better option, then they can move. There's freedom of movement. There's no long-term commitments. It's not like many people's on-premise environment with Oracle, where they genuinely feel locked in. But you have to keep listening. And so one of the things we just recently did, customers said, yes, I can move, but gee, if I really want to move, there's an expense because now I have to move my data. And so 2 months ago, we announced that any customer who's unsatisfied with AWS and wants to move their estate, we give them a window of free data exit. We're not seeing that as a pattern, but it's one of those questions that customers need to sort through. The second part of no lock-in is, frankly, an architectural approach, and you can build things, from building blocks, or you can consume services. As long as you do it in a structured fashion and you make that a deliberate choice, I'm not going to build my own data warehouse, but I'm going to choose an architectural approach so that I make sure I own the architecture, I own the data flows. Then you can use a service and go faster, and you can always back out. So we advise customers on those two different things: is make sure you know what your contracts say and that you truly have the ability to move. There's not a long-term commitment, and if possible, that there's no cost for taking your data. That's what we just fixed. And then also make smart buy versus build architecture decisions.
Anyone else have any questions for our distinguished panel?
If I can just jump back on the notion of data sovereignty, and we talked a lot about the control of data, how we keep control of our data, and definitely that's probably what AWS offers. But there is still a question I have about the fact that, and I have no doubt that AWS does not want to comply with intrusive American laws. But in the end, there is still a legal competition between the European law and the American law. And another aspect we didn't talked about in the previous discussion is the fact that data sovereignty is also about developing industrial capabilities. And I think we need to give the time and the resources to European industries to develop and especially to scale up, because I think the main problem in this question of sovereignty is the access to markets, and the market which is largely dominated by a few players. So I think this is also something we can definitely insist on. And subventions, government subsidies are good, but we also need public procurement on these issues, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if there was a European champion, perhaps we wouldn't be having this discussion about whether or not to be friends with Max.
Well, I think we're going to be friends. I think we figured that out.
We will.
But let me just, based on your sort of comment. So we 100% believe in investment in Europe. And we 100% believe that that innovation is not a company boundary thing or a country boundary thing. Innovation is smart people all around the world, and that's what drives advancement like this. And so in the area of AI, which is the hot area today, we support AI startups all around the world, and very specifically in France. Last month, we announced a 1.2 billion euro investment to help AI development, in France, and in fact, we're helping it all across Europe. And so, that type of innovation and that type of economic, benefit that you receive from startups in today's world largely relies upon having secure hyperscale cloud capabilities. So again, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a how do we do these responsibly together, and then specifically the European sovereign cloud. All operations is going to be in Europe, entirely staffed with EU residents, and that's our approach to making sure that we have a organizational entity that understands the obligations of EU law and compliance with the EU law, and we operate in a world where we want the rule of law to be able to drive the right outcomes. And so I think that's, along with all the technical measures and the other operational control measures, I think that's what we're trying to achieve across the whole cloud, but very specifically with the EU sovereign cloud.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And yeah.